so many people just say that Saturn return is 3 years long, and that's just not true. And I'm really here to help you break that limiting belief or that fear, if there is any around it, for your Saturn return. It usually won't last more than a year. Hi, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Kelsey, here to teach you astrology and human design in a simple way you can easily understand to remember who you are. I am so excited about the topic of today's video because I hear this misconception about Saturn return so often. I was literally earlier today at a coffee shop that I go to all the time, and I overheard some women talking about Saturn return and how there was a girl saying she was 26 and she was about to start her Saturn return, and someone was saying they were 30 and they were like just ending their Saturn return, and then they were like, oh yeah, my Saturn's at this degrees and blah blah. And it was so cool to hear this conversation happening, but it inspired something in me to create this video to talk about Saturn return, because Saturn return does not last 3 years. I feel like this is really the biggest lie we have all been told about Saturn return, and it's just not true. So I hope in relieving that belief or that fear of Saturn return itself, this helps to alleviate some of that, because it's not as long lasting as I've heard so many other people talk about it being. It definitely doesn't start at 26 or 27. It peaks just before you turn 30. For most people, on average, that peak happens around 29.5 years of age. But this does depend on your Saturn and what Saturn is doing in the sky, right? We have to look at the current transits, and we have to look at how they're going to impact us on an individual level based on your chart. And this is what I teach you to be able to do in my Become an Astrologer course, is how to understand how to read your chart and apply the transits to it and know what's going on for you at any given time you're seeking guidance or support. You can just pull up your chart, pull up the transits, and know what is going on for you when you know how to read the language of the cosmos. And that's what I teach you with my Become an Astrologer course. For the sake of this video, we're going to apply that to Saturn return. Now, you can Google Saturn return chart calculator and find one. I would not recommend using ChatGPT for this, because ChatGPT gets transits wrong so much more than it ever has gotten them right for me. And I've heard this mirrored through other people as well. I would not trust ChatGPT, even the astrology plugins, to get certain dates right, because it's never really gotten them right for me before. So I would really advise you to kind of learn how to do this for yourself, just to double check anything if you do go through AI, because 9 times out of 10 it's gonna get things wrong. And this is also why I think there can never be too many astrologers, because like AI, I don't think will ever finesse astrology right. And anyways, there's always going to be a demand for people who can actually do this themselves. And if you can do it yourself, it puts you ahead of the curve. It puts you ahead of that need and that demand that is only growing as we get more into the Aquarius age, and Pluto in Aquarius specifically. Okay, so back to Saturn return. Saturn return, like I said, you can Google a Saturn return chart calculator and it will give you the exact dates. I like astro.com, I think they have one, and I think Horoscopes Seek has one or something like that, but just go to whatever comes up when you Google it, and it will give you those dates. Now, like I said too, this all depends on what Saturn is doing and the future transits. If Saturn is going to go retrograde over your natal Saturn, then your return can happen 3 times. This isn't the case for everybody, but again, just double check what's going to be going on with Saturn. You can use something called an ephemeris too. This is literally the book that astrologers used to use to find and build charts before there was software for it. This is like the OG place to find transits. I teach you how to read this in my intermediate astrology course, because obviously we have great softwares to be able to use nowadays, and that's what I teach you how to use in my Become an Astrologer course, my entry-level astrology course. But in like level 2 intermediate astrology, I teach you how to read this and how to really consult this book to find transits, because it is like the Bible, the astrology transit Bible. And so you can really easily use that to track the movements of Saturn, specifically on how it's going to aspect and conjunct with your natal Saturn, right? That's what Saturn return is. And every single planet we have in our chart eventually will have a return. So the solar return is our birthday. It's when the sun returns to the same place it was at the time when you were born. Mars return, same thing. Jupiter return, Saturn return, as we're talking about in this video, and probably the most common return that we hear of in the astrology world. But it happens with every single placement that you have. Nodal return, Venus return. It won't happen with Uranus unless you live to be 84 or older. It obviously won't happen with any of those outer planets unless you live a really long time on Earth. But other than that, every planet does return at some point to the position in which it is natally in your chart, right? And so again, Saturn return is probably the most talked about and the most misunderstood. So many people just say that Saturn return is 3 years long, and that's just not true. And I'm really here to help you break that limiting belief or that fear, if there is any around it, for your Saturn return. Saturn return only lasts about 6 to 8 months. Now this can be a longer process if it goes retrograde over your natal Saturn, like I've already mentioned. But even if that is the case, it usually won't last more than a year. And there will be a kind of break depending on, again, your Saturn and where it's going to be going retrograde, at what degrees, and all of that. There could be a break from your Saturn return, and then when it comes close to your Saturn again, and you have like a second kind of Saturn return, right? Now, I do have to add that even though your Saturn return only really happens for 10 to 12 months, you will probably still feel the effects of Saturn in whatever house you have Saturn in natally, because for most of us, it will still be in that house, even when it is not on top of or close to our natal Saturn, right? So this, I think, is maybe what contributed to the misconception that Saturn return lasts 3 years, because Saturn return stays in one house of your chart for 2.5 years, and then depending on retrogrades, it can go back and be there for up to 3 years, depending. But let's not confuse Saturn in a house and how that shows up with Saturn return itself, because Saturn return is a very specific thing. Saturn return is when Saturn gets close to and on top of, or peaks on, your natal Saturn. And so those dates are going to be the most intense, when you will feel Saturn's return the most, because that's when it's actually happening. Versus when Saturn is just moving through a house for you, it's just showing up as Saturn is moving through a house for you. This is why you don't feel your Saturn return when Saturn's in your 5th house and you have your natal Saturn in your 6th house. You will feel Saturn's presence in your 5th house, right? In that area of your life. But just because Saturn is in the same house as your natal Saturn doesn't mean that when that's happening, it's your Saturn return. Saturn return is only when Saturn is close to or on top of your natal Saturn, and I give this about a 7-degree orb. The act of Saturn return itself only peaks for like a couple of weeks. I love that that rhymed. I'm loving these rhymes lately in all my videos because I don't consciously do them, but they just come out of my mouth. So let's take my Saturn return as an example, right? My Saturn return peaked on March 1st of 2024. That was the day that it peaked, right? And that was like a month and a half, 2 months almost, before my 30th birthday. And this is why I said that Saturn return will happen for you sometime in your 29th year. That is the first initial peak of the return. And what I mean by peak is when it goes exact. So I have Saturn at 10 degrees of Pisces. When Saturn was in 10 degrees of Pisces in the current transits, my Saturn return peaked, right? Because it was exactly where my natal Saturn is. So that's what the peak means, and that's the most intense it's going to feel. That's the most intense it's going to be. And for me, nothing really major happened. I mean, I've been really having a huge evolution in terms of my sense of self over the last 4 years, I would say, and really growing into a new version of myself. Also, entrepreneurship has accelerated that path for me, I believe. And a lot of that was exacerbated by other important, crucial, life-changing transits that happen around 27 to 29 that have nothing to do with Saturn return itself. Those transits I've talked about in my inner circle and my membership are the nodal opposition, the Pluto sextile Pluto, and the lunar progression coming to a close. Basically around 27 and a half, your progressed lunar cycle comes to a close because your progressed moon makes it all the way back to your natal moon. And so that's the ending of a whole progressed lunar cycle. Now, I talk about that in my class on it in my inner circle in my membership. If you want to learn more about that and how to find yours. But those 3 transits are really life-changing and are really major indicators of change, especially as it relates to the sense of self, the soul, the purpose, emotions. And Saturn return just is kind of like an icing on the cake to all of those changes that are happening, building up to the actual Saturn return. They will kind of pressure you and push you into alignment, to align with your true purpose, your true path. And this is why I promote learning astrology and human design for everybody, because it helps you to be able to do that in a way that's much easier and simpler had you not have these tools and resources to be able to understand yourself and your purpose and how to live into alignment. And really at the end of the day, that's what Saturn return kind of comes around to show you, is how to really step fully into your path, your purpose, yourself, and come back home to your true self. This is why like women in their 30s are known for not taking shit anymore. Like they're not as naive, they're not as innocent as women in their 20s, right? I myself very much relate to that. When you hit your 30s, like, things really change. And this is because all of the transits that happen in the late 20s to early 30s that create that change, that create that need to set boundaries, to not take bullshit from anybody, to really have discernment around what's right for you and what's not, to really know yourself better than you have your whole life. I like to say that the 20s are like teenage years, but like adult teenage years, because you're really finding out who you are separate from your parents, like, for the first time in your life, right? And so it's kind of like just another stage of learning to step into who you are, and all of that kind of congomulates. What's that word? Congomulates? Y'all know what I'm talking about. At Saturn Return. Like, Saturn Return is the gateway. Saturn Return is the junction where all of that work and all of those major transits that happen before Saturn Return come to a fruition. And we move through the gateway of maturation and adulthood, and we really step into this new version of ourselves that feels more aligned with who we are and what we're doing and how we're sharing that with the world, right? It's more aligned with your purpose than ever. Saturn Return is also about coming back home to who you are. Like, doing the whole process of removing conditioning and limiting beliefs that were creating this version of yourself that wasn't truly you, it wasn't your true essence. And again, this is why I'm a huge advocate for everybody learning astrology and human design, because it helps you to understand that about yourself and how to come home to who you truly are. And if we don't integrate these lessons and learn these kind of things at the first Saturn return, it will come back around for us to look at the second Saturn return that happens at age 58. Because Saturn returns to the same place that it was in your natal chart every 29 and a half years. But to go back to my Saturn return example and the dates of it, I like to give a 7-degree orb to transits of this nature. So I would say, like I've said, my Saturn is at 10 degrees, so I would give myself about 7 degrees of orb. So whenever Saturn moved to 3 degrees or so, that's when I would kind of start to feel Saturn's approach to my natal Saturn. I practice what I preach, so I'm going to use my ephemeris to look at these exact dates. I have looked at them before, but I don't have them memorized and I didn't write them down, so we're doing this in real time. It looks like Saturn started coming up on my Saturn really quick on the final days of December in 2023. I distinctly remember this time for me because I was very, very frustrated with where I was currently living because my landlord had increased the rate of rent, in which I didn't really feel fair, but I didn't speak up about. And my Saturn is in the 6th house, so I'm really here to assert my needs and my boundaries in ways that feel fair to me, in ways that feel like this is actually what I need in order to feel good about this. This is what I need to feel supported and cared for and nurtured, right? Kind of 6th house themes of what is going to support my physical space and my physical body and my ability to do so. And Saturn rules my 4th house. So this has really been the major theme of my Saturn return. So started at the end of December 2023. We're gonna say basically it started in New Year's, January of 2024. And then like I said, it peaked on March 1st of 2024. And 2 days before that, I kid you not, there was other transits going on too. The sun, I think, was conjunct my Saturn at that time because this was Pisces season. I think there was another, the moon was there or something else. And literally my house flooded. I had just moved into a new home that I felt was so expansive for me. It was my dream home back then. It was what I wanted to move into. After that kind of situation with my last landlord, I wanted just a space that felt really spacious, that felt really open, that felt really this is my next level, right? So I'd moved into that home at the end of February, and a week later, 2 days before my Saturn return, it flooded overnight. And I couldn't be there for 10 days while they were doing mitigation and repairing all the drywall and all the things. And it was this whole thing. That's really the major thing that happened at my Saturn return, was this big setback feeling oh, I want to step into this new level and I'm here, but I'm kind of having to take a step back from fully being in it for 10 days or whatever. So that was an interesting thing that happened at my Saturn return, but it really wasn't that big of a deal. I had other accommodations and my landlords were amazing and really accommodating and super helpful and supportive during the whole thing. So it was really just kind of an inconvenience. It wasn't anything traumatic or anything that had happened. It was just oh, this kind of sucks that I just moved in here and I can't be there for like 2 weeks almost, but it honestly, other than that, it was fine. And it actually worked out in my benefit for like the insurance and everything. It actually gave me a really positive return financially. Okay, so let's see. Next thing I'm looking for is when Saturn is going to be at 77 degrees of orb after it peaked with my natal Saturn, right? So we've already looked at the pre-Saturn return and when Saturn started to put pressure, and now we're going to look at the aftermath when Saturn started to move away from my natal Saturn. So I'm going to look for 10 plus 7 degrees of orb is 17. So I'm going to look for when Saturn got to about 18 degrees of Pisces, and that was like the end of my Saturn return. Now that happened on May 19th, 2024. So if we add all that together, my Saturn return was only about 6 months. And there was a kind of retrograde that happened, but it never went back to my exact Saturn placement. So we're gonna add that on too to give you a running total of how long my Saturn return actually was. So Saturn started to return to 17 degrees of Pisces because it went retrograde mid-August of 2024. Now this was a really stressful time for me because I was about to go to France and just have a Europe trip for several months, and I didn't know how long I wanted to be there. I didn't know if I wanted to move homes before that too, because my lease was ending, and I ultimately decided to move into storage and just stay over in Europe for however long I felt I wanted to be there, which ended up being 4 months. But so that was kind of like mid-August for me, and kind of Saturn putting that pressure on my home again. Saturn went direct after its retrograde cycle at 12 degrees of Pisces in middle of November 2024. So that was really close to my Saturn, 2 degrees away. So I was really feeling it then, honestly, like November, December. When Saturn got a lot closer to my natal Saturn again, I really started to feel that pressure from it. But again, nothing like crazy happened. It was just, I'm really learning my standards, my boundaries, and how to stand up for myself to have them, and how to create that consistency of like asking for them or being like steadfast in them. So now we're gonna look for when Saturn went back to 18 degrees of Pisces and was like far enough away from my natal Saturn to consider my Saturn return over. And that date is February 6th of 2025. So if we add up all those dates together, January to May of 2024, and then we're gonna go from middle of August to the first week of February 2025. So what is that? January, February, March, April, May, August, September, October, November, December, January, February. So like a year. So your Saturn return really only lasts a year. But that's only the total time I was feeling it, right? I had a break from like May of 2024 until August of 2024. So that was a break of like 3 months of really not feeling it, of not feeling affected by it, of it kind of being a reprieve from feeling the intensity of it. So there we have it. Maybe you're hearing it here first. Saturn return really only lasts like about 12 months. Definitely not 3 years. And the peak period really only lasts like 1 month, where you're going to be feeling it the most, unless it goes retrograde, and that happens another 2 times. But honestly, I say this about retrogrades all the time. The like worst of a retrograde is going to be before it actually happens. When something goes retrograde and then that planet moves over your planet, your natal planet, like in retrograde, you're more or internally focused on those lessons, and you've already been through it. So there's really not a whole lot of surprises that come with that. And then once the planet goes direct again and moves over your planet again, it's like a final integration of that lesson, and really learning to embody it and integrate it, right? And it's not as bad as the first time it happened, because you've already been through that energy twice before. And to give you an example of what that looks like too, just for another example, because I always find that personal examples are really helpful for me when I'm learning something new or being exposed to something. Like, it's really important to have that practical example. And I give you those in my astrology courses, my human design courses as well. They are filled with practical advice and information based on my personal experiences and witnessing people around me's charts, how I've seen it all play out and show up based on other people in my life too. So I love to incorporate that in what I teach to you as well, because I feel like it really helps with the learning process. So without further ado, here's another example of somebody who's gonna have that Saturn return peak 3 different times because of the retrograde. So this person actually has their Saturn retrograde natally, and so they might feel more comfortable with the lessons of Saturn in general when Saturn is retrograde, because that's their home placement, that's their natal placement to begin with. So the lessons of Saturn for them are really internal. It's really about their inner world and their identity, and maybe how that's showing up on the external from what the inner foundation is. Versus someone who has Saturn direct in the chart, that's really going to be an external reflection of commitment, of discipline, of all things connected to Saturn. So for this person, their Saturn return peaked on March 31st, 2025. Following the 7 degrees of orb rule, we're going to look to when their Saturn return kind of started, when Saturn started to move towards their Saturn, put a little bit of pressure there, when they probably started to feel it more. So for this person, that was probably around the end of January 2025. Their Saturn is at 24 degrees. Saturn went to 17 degrees of Pisces at the end of January 2025. And then, like I said, it peaked on March 31st. Now they're going to get a reprieve from that energy when Saturn moves into Aries and leaves Pisces, because that will be outside of the orb of Saturn being close to their Saturn. That happens at the end of May 2025. So first look at Saturn return for them started the end of January 2025 and goes until the end of May 2025. That's about 4 months. Then Saturn will retrograde, move back into Pisces at the beginning of September 2025, so they'll probably start to feel it again then. It will go direct, really close to their natal Saturn at 25 degrees of Pisces, and then move back into Aries, putting them in the clear middle of February 2026. So that is still about 12 months. They started feeling it at the end of January until the end of May. That's 4 months. They got a reprieve from the end of May until the beginning of September. That's June, July, August. 3 months of reprieve, and then they will feel it again from September to February, which is September, October, November, December, January, February. 6 months plus 4 months, that's 10 months. So even for them, since it goes retrograde, they're still only going to have 10 months total time of feeling the effects of Saturn return. So there we have it. I hope that clears up Saturn return for you and how long it lasts, and maybe takes away some of the anxiety or the worry about it. Having lived through my Saturn return already, can just tell you it's really not as bad as people say, especially if you're already aligned with your true path and you've been learning about yourself through astrology, human design, or other modalities. You've been doing the spiritual healing work on yourself. Saturn return can really be like an ascension. Can you hear that construction noise? Because I feel like that's our validation and confirmation. Like, Saturn return is really about stepping into this new life fully aligned with yourself and your purpose, right? And that's kind of what Saturn will shake things up for you to be able to do. It's really a recalibration to your true self and your true path, and building a solid foundation of those things, right? Saturn is the planet of stability, of a foundation, of being consistent and disciplined with what you're building so that it lasts for your whole lifetime. Jupiter energy, I talk about this in my courses. Jupiter energy to me is like fast, quick, like winning the lottery. Saturn is like building generational wealth for yourself and your whole family, like after you are gone from this planet, right? So that's the energy of Saturn. And once we reframe that and start to see it differently and see it as something that can be really beneficial for ourselves and our lives and what we're building that we want to last, maybe stick around for lifetimes. How did this resonate with you? When was your Saturn return? When is your Saturn return? Let's chat about it in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!